Welcome everybody to this research seminar with Michael Grätz, Measuring Equality of Opportunity. I guess this is going to be a topic that is perfect for the Institute because it's going to interest many fields. So I'm happy to see people from sociology and economics and political science and philosophy here. So many questions about that. So Michael is an associate professor at the Swedish Institute for Social Research and also at Lausanne, University of Lausanne. You work with Carina Mood's group at Sophie. And you have earlier been a researcher here, 2018 and 19. And you have published, of course, some paper on this on measuring equality of opportunity, one from 2023, and empirical approaches to that. But you also published with Martin Kolk on similarity in income, and then also different things on parental separation of educational achievement and similar things. So we are very much looking forward to hear what you have to say. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation. And thanks for the introduction. So from the beginning, I'm saying I'm a sociologist. That's why I put the emphasis in the title on measuring. So that is what I'm trying to do. So the research question underlying all this is how much equality of opportunity is there in contemporary societies? And I'm going to show results for the US, Sweden, and Germany. So how much equality of opportunity is there? And this, what I'm going to show is joint work with Alicia Garcia Sierra, who's a postdoc with me, and Sonia Petrini, who's a doctoral student, and Kieran Barclay, a demographer from Stockholm University. So the first thing that we are interested in as social scientists is inequality of condition or inequality of outcome. So this means people have different life chances, so this is about income, but you can think about life chances. We think about life chances as a very general thing, which includes education, occupation, income, health, anything that people could be interested in having. And then the first thing you would be studying is inequality, okay, inequality of outcome. And a different thing is inequality of opportunity. And inequality of opportunity always requires some normative conceptions about the origins of this inequality and whether you consider these origins to be just or unjust. So for instance, you can imagine that these two people differ in their income because they have different abilities, but they have the same ascribed characteristics. Or you can think that they differ because of their ascribed characteristics, but they have the same abilities. Okay. So this is
Michael, can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean with ascribed characteristics?
I'm coming to that on that. So ascribed characteristics is really a general term which underlies kind of the empirical sociological research. So this is one review paper on educational inequality, and there the authors write a common distinction within this area is between inequality of opportunity and inequality of condition. The former has its origin in the liberal goal that a person's chances to get ahead, attain education, get a good job, should be unrelated to ascribed characteristics such as race, sex, or class, or socioeconomic origin. The latter, inequality of condition, is concerned with the distribution of differential rewards and living conditions. So sociologists have this idea that there are some fixed ascribed characteristics, which are race, sex, and social origin. So these are the most often studied. And basically this means it's unjust if these things affect your life chances, but it's just if abilities affect the life chances. Okay, so this is kind of the classical, I would say, the dominant view in sociology, and to some degree also, not in all, but in some economics. And this corresponds. So this is why I call this liberal equality of opportunity. This conception of equality of opportunity, because it's called liberal here, and this corresponds to what John Rawls defines as fair equality of opportunity in the theory of justice. Okay, so there he gives this definition of fair equality of opportunity, that those with similar abilities and skills should have similar life chances, more specifically assuming that there's a distribution of natural assets. Those who are at the same level of talent and ability and have the same willingness to use them should have the same prospects of success regardless of their initial place in the social system, that is irrespective of the income class into which they are born. So this corresponds closely to how the sociologists think about this. And these are, coming back again to the questions, what are ascribed characteristics? These are some things that sociologists have been studying. These are fixed factors, and they are considered, their impact on life chances is considered unjust. So of course, in the kind of literature where I'm from, people mostly study characteristics referring to the parents, such as parental education, parental income, and so on. But then there's of course also big literature on gender differences in life chances. There's migration background. But there are also some things that vary among siblings. So for instance, there's quite consistent effect, I think evidence that birth order has an effect on life chances, meaning that if you're later born in a family, you have lower life chances. And then of course also the time period where you're born has an effect, because if you're born now, you have different life chances than someone else who was born 20 years ago. So this is, I would say, these are ascribed characteristics. This is what we consider as ascribed characteristics. And the idea is that you should, they shouldn't affect life chances because you don't have control over it. And this is kind of the sociology idea. And this is now my favors, and this is because it's a lottery in which family you're born. And so this is the most funny quote coming out of this presentation. So this is by a philosopher who criticizes this sociological perspective. So from an equity perspective, children's life chances should depend less on the lottery of birth than on their own latent abilities. So this is what Esping Andersen, one of the most famous, probably the most famous sociologist, has written. And then this philosopher Richard Anderson writes, this is on his face an odd claim. If anything, it is a sheer lottery beyond one's power to control. It is the process that determines one's latent abilities. These are already present at conception in utero before the individual has had any chance to make an effort or to do anything that might qualify as conferring extra desert. So this is a different approach to equality of opportunity from which this comes, I think. And this is what is called the luck egalitarianism in philosophy. And this is one definition. So this is from a book from Gerald Cohn, where basically equality of opportunity is defined this way. Inequalities are just if and only if they reflect patterns of choice and of failures to choose on the part of the people among whom the inequality prevails. Okay? But this is a very different definition of equality of opportunity than saying that ascribed characteristics such as social class, gender, and so on shouldn't affect life chances. So here it's anything that you have no control over should affect life chances, and this includes abilities. So this is kind of the central distinction, and this is what I call then radical equality of opportunity. So in general, we can think about that life chances are determined by 4 different factors. So one is these ascribed characteristics, social class, gender, migration background, and so on. One is abilities. One is then individual choices. But there's also a 4th thing, which is kind of random luck. So this is kind of that you're just at the right place at the right time, and this may also affect your life chances. Okay. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make this distinction between liberal and radical equality of opportunity, which basically differ in whether they consider the effect of abilities on life chances as just or unjust. So both of them consider the effect of ascribed characteristics as unjust on life chances, but from the kind of liberal perspective, which is the dominant perspective in empirical sociological research, the effects of abilities of life chances on life chances are considered as just. But they aren't just from this kind of luck egalitarian radical perspective. And then these things, both of them can differ from inequality of outcome, because both of them consider the effects of choices that are freely made on life chances as just or unjust. And then there's also the issue is what to do with random luck, which I think gets a lot of attention in the philosophical discussion. But in this presentation, there's no solution to this because there's no way to measure it. So I'm not going to actually be able to distinguish luck from choices. But of course, if you take a very strong radical perspective, then you also consider the impact of luck on life chances as unjust. Okay, so I'm trying to measure differences in liberal and radical equality of opportunity. And what I'm now, so that's the kind of the first part. That was the theory part. And what I now want to do is I want to go through the literature that has been used in empirical research in sociology and economics, and I would like to discuss whether they measure liberal or radical equality of opportunity and how they are doing it. So the first literature is, and this is the biggest literature, is intergenerational mobility. So this is relating some characteristics of the parents to some characteristics of the child. So for instance, income mobility measures the association between parental income and child income. and that's it, nothing more. And then we can take basically from this equation, if we have parental income and child income, we have a coefficient, and if we take the R square, we have kind of the explained inequality by this relationship, which would be kind of the measure of inequality of opportunity, then we get out of this approach. And the first question to ask is this supposed to measure equality of opportunity? Some people take a very defensive view by saying intergenerational mobility research just measures intergenerational mobility, but some are more direct. So this is one sociologist, and these are two economists from Stockholm University, and both are basically saying that yes, intergenerational mobility is supposed to measure equality of opportunity. Okay, but the question is whether this is the case or not, and which kind of equality of opportunity they are measuring. So this is just to give some empirical answer to the question, if this is our approach to equality of opportunity, how much inequality is there? And so for instance, in one study on income mobility in Sweden, so this is on Swedish data, they get this result. No, I think this is on different countries actually. So this is the regression coefficient, and this would, if you take the R square, which is the explained variance, this would means that there's between kind of 2.5% and 16% of inequality is unjust. So there would be the 2.5 to 16% of inequality is unjust from this, if we use this as the measure of equality of opportunity. So that's the empirical finding. But the question is, what does this really tell us about equality of opportunity? And I would argue that it's actually, if at all, it measures liberal inequality of opportunity because it relates one ascribed characteristic to a measure of life chances, parental income. But it's also an imperfect measure of even liberal inequality. And for three different reasons. For two reasons, it underestimates the amount of inequality, and for one reason, it overestimates actually the amount of inequality. So it underestimates. So the first thing is why it underestimates the amount of inequality is because parental income is not the only ascribed characteristic that affects life chances. So there are many more things to measure that should be included, and some even may also vary across siblings. So meaning from children who have the same parents, they could also differ then. So it would not be the same. So that would be a second reason. But there's also an important reason, and this often gets unnoticed in the empirical literature, why this actually overestimates inequality, because part of this intergenerational coefficient is also driven by the transmission of abilities across generations. And if you consider the effects of abilities on life chances as just, you also have to consider as just if parents transmit abilities to their children. Okay, so this means we also have to correct these estimates for the fact that part of it is due to the transmission of abilities across generations. So then there's one approach which kind of tries to address this point, and this is basically by including more parental characteristics than just income. So we can have so this is for instance on a paper from Karina Muth where she does this. And it's basically, we can have more parental characteristics than just one. So income mobility would just be taking parental income related to child income. But in this paper, Karina Muth takes income, occupation, and education. Okay, and then we can take the R square of this equation, and this is going to explain more of the variance because we are accounting for more parental factors. So that is the basic idea. So in terms of empirical results, then she finds in terms of earnings, this is also in Sweden, in Swedish data, that between 8 and 11% of inequality is unjust. Again, I would say this is a measure of liberal inequality of opportunity, but this result is already higher than in the previous approach. So this is kind of the second approach that people have been using. The third approach is a slightly different one, and these are so-called sibling correlations. So sibling correlations basically take the similarity of siblings from the same family as a measure of inequality of opportunity. So this is a paper we did on different countries, and so education is the outcome, and so for instance, so in Germany and the US, kind of 50%. These estimates are 0.5, which means that siblings are to 50% similar in their education, meaning that inequality if you take this approach, would be 50%, right? So, and you're doing this because you then not only include characteristics of the parents that you can observe in the estimation, but there are also characteristics that you don't observe. And this is why these estimates of the sibling correlations are much higher than the estimates if you just add up parent characteristics in the regression model. Yes, please.
Sorry for the interruption of this nice talk, but like the 11%, can you say a little bit more about them?
So
I mean, like, okay, this is, but what does this actually say?
This says that 11% of inequality is unjust. I mean, that is kind of the whole idea of what we are trying to do, is to get a number that tells us this amount of inequality that we observe is unjust. Okay?
Okay.
So that is.
I think the question is, I mean, so you have a measure here, so you can make sense of 11%.
Yes, this is
some kind of cardinal measure.
So this is explained variance in statistical terms.
Okay.
This is explained variance. But the substantive interpretation, from my perspective, is so much inequality is unjust. Then, of course, one number alone doesn't mean much, right? You probably are going to look at this by comparing it across countries or comparing it across cohorts or something. This is more the interesting stuff, because, but from the understanding side here, I mean, from the statistical side, what we're talking about is explained variance of regression models. Okay. But that's the same here. This is also explained variance, but with a different approach. So, and this explained variance is for Sweden, I think the estimate is something like 42%. So it's much higher. And this is just an empirical effect which you already know since a long time, that sibling correlations give us higher estimates of inequality of opportunity than intergenerational mobility estimates. And this is why the approach we're going to show later is based on sibling correlations, simply because there are unobserved characteristics of the parents which also affect life chances. Okay. But again, this is only a measure of Libel inequality of opportunity, and intended to be a Libel inequality of opportunity. So these are the equation for the sibling correlation approach. You basically have a model in which you have individuals, but they are nested within families. And then you can decompose the error term into two parts, and one which varies across individuals and one which varies at the family level. And if you estimate the sibling correlation, you look at the total variance, and you look at how much of this total variance is similar across siblings. So this is what this estimate tells you. So again, it's explained variance, and the explained variance in terms of similarity in life chances between siblings. So these were three approaches that were trying to measure Libel inequality of opportunity. Then there are two approaches which are trying to measure radical inequality of opportunity. So one is the surname approach by Gregory Clark. So the surname approach is a very different approach, because it's not really based on individual level data. It actually uses the occurrence of rare surnames in mostly elite positions. Okay, and then he has different data sets for different countries, and then he gets these super high estimates of inequality of opportunity. Okay, and this is quite explicitly measuring radical inequality of opportunity, because at least Gregory Clark argues that this also picks up abilities to a large degree. So for instance, and then he compares this to intergenerational correlations, and he finds estimate which are around 80%. And also the other thing that he tries to argue is that this is very similar across countries, that it doesn't vary across countries. So this kind of is a very different approach than the other ones, because it's comparing groups and not individuals, and it takes kind of rare surnames, and if they are more common among the elite, and if they stay more common, then there's this idea, then there's high immobility. Okay. So this approach is explicitly try to measure radical inequality of opportunity, and only radical inequality of opportunity. The approach has also been criticized because it's not, as I said, unlike the other approaches that we're talking about, it is not based on individual level data, but on aggregated group data. And group level processes can be different than individual level processes. The other approach that tries to measure radical inequality of opportunity comes from an economist, philosopher who's very much related to the luck egalitarianism movement, John Roemer, who has set out this kind of approach to measuring equality of opportunity. In, I think from 1998 is the book, but then there are many empirical applications doing it. And what this approach is basically doing, so he talks about circumstances in the book, and circumstances is everything which you don't have control over. So he's also quite clearly about that IQ is part of the circumstances. So he's very, so meaning that abilities are also unjust from this perspective. And then he basically, I mean, the actual approach is much more complicated, but this is kind of a simplified and comparable to the others. It's basically a regression model in which you include all the circumstances, and again, you're looking at the explained variance of all these circumstances. The difference is only that in this approach, abilities are included, while they are kind of excluded in the kind of other approaches before. Okay, and then you get also again an estimate of how much inequality there is. So again, there's an example of what the results then show. So these are results for Sweden. So this is the statement. This is actually about how much is due to choices. The economists like to call the choices effort, but effort is also again a bit, I think, a term which is maybe not the best, because some non-cognitive skills are clearly part of the abilities that you cannot control. And they could also be understood as effort, or psychologists understand them as effort. So I prefer the word individual choices, but then this means that 30 to 40% of inequality would be unjust from the perspective of now this is measuring radical inequality of opportunity. So this is an approach which measures radical inequality of opportunity and only radical inequality of opportunity. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to measure both liberal and radical inequality of opportunity because we want to compare them to each other. And what we're also doing is we're basically doing something similar like they did, but we're basing this on the sibling approach, because the sibling approach produces higher estimates of inequality of opportunity simply because it can account for unobserved variables. Which is also say here because these estimates are actually lower than the sibling correlations before. So this was kind of the literature review. Then there's one other literature that we are trying to refer to, and this is the literature on social science genetics. Because in this kind of social science genetics literature, there has been actually one very dominant view which has been arguing by many people in this literature that the amount, let's say the strength of the effects of genes on life chances is actually an indicator of inequality of opportunity. So for instance, there's a PNS paper where they are comparing heritability estimates across countries, and they show that there's a relationship between intergenerational mobility and heritability estimates, and they interpret it in this way. Our results just suggest that environmental differences underlie variation in intergenerational mobility, and that there is no tension between egalitarian policies and the realization of individual genetic potential. So meaning that if genes affect life chances, it's a good thing because it means that society is more egalitarian. But this is of course only the case from the liberal perspective of equality of opportunity and not from the radical perspective. And this is also something that K.P. Harden has argued in this recent book, that actually this is a lottery, and that if you take a radical approach to equality of opportunity, you consider the effects of genes on life chances as unjust. Okay, so this is one example of a book which argues that the effects of genes on life chances should actually be considered as unjust because you don't have control over the genes you are born with. So this would be the radical interpretation of the effects of genes on life chances. So these are the 3 research questions that we're going to talk about in our results. First, does it actually matter? Do liberal and radical equality of opportunity differ from each other? Second, do they vary across different measures of life chances? And third, do they vary across countries? So the first thing is whether they vary across different measures of life chances. I think you can also, whether you want to take a liberal approach to equality of opportunity or a radical approach to equality of opportunity, may be a function of the measure of life chances you look at, right? So there's at least a kind of in functionalism, there's the idea that people have to be allocated to certain positions in a society, and this may be a function for efficiency reasons based on abilities. But the question is whether this also, but of course these things also affect health outcomes or mortality or morbidity, which are probably further away, and you're more likely to argue that there should be radical equality of opportunity, I think, with respect to these outcomes and then to others. So we're trying to look at these different outcomes and see whether there's variation in the difference between liberal and radical equality of opportunity with respect to these different outcomes. Even though I'm not showing results for mortality and morbidity here, but this is something we're trying to look at. So as I already said, I mean, the approach is slightly complicated because we're looking at between and within family variation, because we are comparing siblings. But the basic idea is very simple, I think. We measure unjust variance from the perspective of liberal and radical equality of opportunity. So what we're trying to measure is inequality. So we're not measuring kind of equality, but we're measuring inequality, meaning that the remaining part is what we consider due to choices. It's of course not completely true because it's due to choices and to luck and to measurement error, but at least that's what we're trying to do. So we are trying to measure unjust inequality, as explained variance. And what we're doing is we're basing this on the sibling correlation approach, and we're modifying it slightly by controlling additionally for factors that vary across siblings, ascribed characteristics that vary across siblings, and for ability differences between siblings. So the starting point is that we estimate sibling correlations in our outcomes, as I said before, and then we estimate these kind of models. So these are multi-level models in which there are siblings nested in families, so individuals who have the same parents. And then we're looking at the variances, and we're looking at how they change when we control for abilities. So these are cognitive and non-cognitive skills, and additionally also for ascribed characteristics that vary between siblings. So this is the sibling correlation. So this is the starting point. This is how much inequality, how similar I am to my siblings in terms of life chances. So this is what this is measuring. And this is now neither measuring, as we argued, this is not measuring liberal and not measuring radical equality of opportunity. So, but we have to change two things to measure liberal inequality of opportunity. So the first thing is what we're doing is we're taking out the similarity of siblings in their abilities, okay? Because the effect of abilities on life chances is actually just from the perspective of liberal equality of opportunity. So we don't want to include this in the measure of liberal inequality of opportunity. So the first component of our measure of liberal inequality of opportunity is a conditional sibling correlation, conditional on abilities. So this is smaller than the actual one because we only take the variance after we control for abilities. But then we want to add ascribed characteristics, differences in the ascribed characteristics that affect life chances between siblings in our measure of liberal inequality of opportunity. So this basically is a measure of how similar I am to my siblings without taking into account our similarity in abilities, and factors that are ascribed characteristics, such as, for instance, gender, leading to inequality between siblings. Okay, so this is the measure of liberal inequality of opportunity that we're having. And these are kind of the ascribed characteristics that differ between siblings, but that we include in the model. So birth order, parental ages, birth spacing, also year of birth, gender, or the region where you're born. So these are things that shouldn't affect the life chances also from the perspective of liberal inequality of opportunity, but that can be different between siblings. Okay, I hope this is more or less clear. The other thing is radical inequality of opportunity. And this is easier because we can take the sibling correlation, and what we want to add is all the differences that are due to ascribed characteristics or ability differences between siblings and how they affect life chances. So this is the second part. So the first part is how similar I am to my siblings, and the second part is anything that we can observe be it an ascribed characteristic or be it an ability that leads to differences between siblings. Okay, so basically our measure of radical equality of opportunity is different from the sibling correlation because it also includes factors that lead to differences between siblings. Okay, so we're trying to combine between and within family inequality in our measure of radical inequality of opportunity. So these are the measures, and now I'm just showing the results for the different countries basically. So this is the first paper which we started with, where we're looking at the United States, and we're using data from the National Longitudinal Study of Youth. We have not so many, 1,400 individuals from 600 families. We are looking at these birth years, and we're measuring years of education, occupational status, and income as the outcome. And what we're doing here is we're using cognitive and non-cognitive skills that we observe in young adulthood. So we're trying to measure them actually at the earliest age that we can measure them. And these are the results. So these are estimates of inequality of opportunity in the United States. And what we're doing is we're showing the intergenerational correlation, the sibling correlation for comparison purposes, and then in green is our measure of liberal inequality of opportunity, and in red our measure of radical inequality of opportunity. Okay. So the first thing to see is radical inequality of opportunity is much higher than liberal inequality of opportunity. So meaning that whether you consider the US, the continental US, to be an unjust society very much depends on the amount of inequality of opportunity. These estimates are explained variances. So meaning that this red bar here means that 65% of inequality of education is unjust under the perspective of radical inequality of opportunity in the US. And it's only close to 30% if you take liberal inequality of opportunity. Okay. So the first thing is these things differ. The second thing is both of these estimates are very different from the kind of traditional estimates, the intergenerational mobility and the sibling correlations estimate. And this is because, as we argue, they are not measuring equality of opportunity, neither liberal nor radical. This is at least the argument.
Thank you. Can you just give a short description of what variables are in these different bars, like the quick version of, yeah.
So this is education.
Mm-hmm.
This is occupation.
Yeah, but in the sibling correlation, liberal inequality of opportunity and radical inequality of opportunity, like which measurements are controlled in the different bars?
Yes, but so basically we're controlling for these factors, and then we are having cognitive and non-cognitive skills in the data. These are the variables that we're using, and then there's the sibling similarity as a measure. So
another question or clarification?
Yeah, so I have another quite similar question. So I was wondering, what are the items or the cognitive, non-cognitive skills, the specific ones that you're looking into? So you mentioned that you observe some of them in young adults. So what are the ones that you have in mind?
Yeah, I mean what we're trying to do is all the information that there's in the data. I mean, it's different with respect to the different data sets. So there are some kind of standards test with respect to cognitive skills. Then non-cognitive skills, I think there are at least the big 5 included in these data, but also some others. And we're trying basically the information to use the maximum information we have with respect to every data set. But it's not always going to be safe.
What are the big 5?
What are the big 5? Good question. But this is about extroversion, introversion. I don't know all of them. It's in the appendix to the paper. Also, from this paper, I know that actually controlling for non-cognitive skills didn't change the results. So the results were really driven by cognitive skills.
Can I answer?
Yeah.
Very quickly.
What about the cognitive?
Yeah, there's some standardized tests that they are doing.
It's an IQ test,
with the children. Yeah.
Just the big 5 is, you can remember it with the acronym OCEAN.
Ocean.
Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion,
Neuroticism.
and agreeableness.
Okay, thank you.
But I said it.
Ocean.
Yes. Okay. So, but including non-cognitive skills, but at least in this paper, the non-cognitive skills were not doing much. But for theoretical reasons, I think you should include non-cognitive skills. And what we are also trying to use is just the maximum information that we can get with respect to every data set. So there's not specificity. Okay, so the first thing is radical liberal differ. Second thing is they are different from the traditional estimates. And third thing is that there's some variation across outcomes, but it's less than we expected it to be. Okay, so the difference between radical and liberal is largest for education, but it's also very large for occupation. And it's also there for the other outcomes, but it's a bit smaller in any ways. Yeah, so that's what we are trying to argue.
So why were they larger than you expected?
So we were kind of, because basically the difference between radical and liberal is the effect of abilities on life chances, right? Because that's how they differ. And we thought that these effects would be strongest for education, occupation, income, and wealth. They would be weaker, especially for wealth. We thought they would be weakest. But there's still a substantive difference in the US data also for wealth in terms of radical. Radical inequality is much higher than liberal inequality of opportunity. And so this is for all siblings. In the US we can also break it down by sisters on brothers. So and the results are very much the same. So I'm only going to show this because if we're going to look at the Swedish results, then we're only going to have brothers. So we're going to compare the Swedish results to the results for brothers for the US. But this is just to show that the results, this is for sisters, are very much the same. I mean, they're a bit larger for brothers actually than they are for sisters, but kind of the general patterns hold up. Even if you look at whether you look at all siblings or whether you only look at brothers or whether you only look at sisters. So that's the idea. So the conclusion about the first study is that it actually matters whether you want to entertain a radical or liberal perspective to inequality of opportunity, because the US is a much more unjust society from the perspective of radical than from the perspective of liberal inequality of opportunity. And the second conclusion, as I said, is kind of the traditional measures that have been used in the literature. They are actually neither approximating liberal nor radical inequality of opportunity. Then there's this kind of difference across the outcomes, but it's smaller than we thought. And then, of course, there are many limitations still to this analysis. So there is still probably a lot of measurement error, also because this is based on survey data. We're trying to account for everything that varies across siblings. But of course, there are data limitations. We cannot control for everything that actually may vary within families. And there's also this issue that I mentioned before, that the remaining part actually is due to luck and also due to individual choices, and we cannot really separate this, even though theoretically we thought. So the Römer approach that I mentioned earlier is a bit different, because he tries to measure actually individual choices, but he uses measures which I think are not so convincing. So he uses education and he uses working hours, and this is partly certainly driven by skills. And then there's also an issue, and that we're going to address in the last study, is that we are observing abilities over the life course, and then they could also already be due to individual choices, or they could be affected by ascribed characteristics. But if we want to measure abilities, we have no other possibility. So in the last paper I'm going to show, we're going to measure genetic differences instead of observed abilities to address this point. But before showing the last paper, I wanted to show the paper on Sweden, where we use administrative data, and basically we use cognitive and non-cognitive skills from the military conscription tests. This is why we have only data on men for Sweden. But we have done a very large sample. We can look at their education, income, occupation, wealth. And what we also were trying to do in this paper, we were trying to expand this a bit into looking at health outcomes. So what we can look at is physical fitness. Then we're looking at height, which we thought is a good test, because abilities shouldn't affect height quite clearly. So there should be no difference between liberal and radical equality of opportunity with respect to height. That was our expectation. but then we're also looking at BMI. So this were kind of the closest to health measures we can get from that data. And these are the results for Sweden. So as I said, this is now only among brothers. So these are very much the same estimates than you saw from the US in terms of methods. It's totally the same. In terms of variables, it's of course a bit different because we are using a different data set, so we have to use the variables that are there. We don't show the intergenerational mobility estimates, but we show the sibling correlation. So the sibling correlation in education is 46%. Okay. Our measure of liberal inequality of opportunity in Sweden is 17%, and our measure of radical inequality of opportunity is 55%. Okay. So radical inequality of opportunity is higher, the liberal one, and both of them are very different from the kind of traditional measure used in the literature. So this is similar than the US is finding, and this also holds for most of these outcomes. As I said, for height, we were not expecting any difference, and we don't see any difference between radical and liberal inequality of opportunity. What we are a bit surprised by is the results for wealth. So this is different for Sweden and from the US. We don't see
what is included in wealth? Is your pension funds included in wealth?
I don't think so.
Totally private.
Just private ones.
So that is kind of the kind of real substantive difference between the results for Sweden and the US. That for wealth we really don't find much of a difference. We also don't find much of a difference between radical and liberal for BMI, but this is also fine. While we do find a huge one for physical fitness. Okay, so this is this varies a lot between radical and liberal inequality of opportunity, but not the other measures. Yeah, for occupation and for income, the results are probably the same. We also have a table where we directly compare the estimates for the US for brothers to these estimates for Sweden. And of course, this is not really testing cross-country differences, because we also didn't try to harmonize the data across countries. But I was showing earlier this study, which was basically showing that there's a relationship between heritability and intergenerational mobility. And this would have meant, translated, that liberal inequality, we know from previous research that liberal equality of opportunity is higher in Sweden than in the US. So this is kind of what we were expecting. So meaning that these estimates are smaller for Sweden than from the US, this we were expecting. But it was not clear whether we are going to find the same thing for radical equality of opportunity, because this previous research study that I mentioned argued actually that the kind of smaller effect of ascribed characteristics on life chances in Sweden come with a higher effect of abilities on life chances in Sweden. So meaning that radical equality of opportunity should actually have been the same level, but you see they are not. So Sweden is kind of a more just society than the US from both the liberal perspective and the radical perspective of equality of opportunity, because also these numbers here are smaller than these numbers. Okay, this is very preliminary. The results are not, as I said, we didn't harmonize the data across different countries. These are separate studies. We're going to do a cross-country comparison with more countries at one point, I hope so. And then we're probably going to have a bit more reliable results on this. But the general finding is the same. So also with respect to the Swedish data, it matters whether you measure radical or liberal inequality of opportunity. And they are also different from sibling correlations, at least. But what we've now found more, even stronger here in Sweden than in the US, is that the difference is this variation across outcomes. So as I said, for wealth, there wasn't much of a difference between radical and liberal inequality of opportunity, but for education and occupation. And there were also more cross-country variation in radical equality of opportunity between at least Sweden and the US than I thought there would be. I thought they would be more similar, because there was this idea that kind of smaller effects of ascribed characteristics come with larger effects of abilities. But that doesn't seem necessarily to be the case. So the third study that I want to show, and that's the last one that I'm showing, and then I'm done, tries to address one limitation. And the one limitation is that we're using observed measures of abilities. And this can be a problem because, for one thing, it can be due to individual choices. Then there's the question whether you want to make children responsible for the choices they make in childhood. Meaning because we observe skills when they are 16 to 20 in both data sets. And the problem is that also ascribed characteristics, so meaning, for instance, higher social economics status families are trying to affect the abilities of their children. Okay, this can also confound the estimates. So in this study, we are trying to address this by, instead of using observed measures of abilities, we're using polygenic indices, which are genetic measures. And I'm going to explain what they are in a minute. And we're doing this on a data set for Germany, where we can observe the same outcomes. The only difference is that we don't have siblings in this data. So what I'm going to show is just going to be results comparing between families. We're trying to do the same thing what we did with siblings now, but the analysis are not done yet. So, but this is just something where we used German survey data where part of the population is genotype. So I want to explain what polygenic indices are so that everyone knows what I'm talking about. So for a long time there was this idea that there would be a few genes that you could identify that affect phenotypes, okay? Measures that we use in social science research. But this idea was actually wrong and people have given up. So what the research has shown is that there's not a single or a few genes which have an effect on social science, on life course outcomes, but there are actually a lot of genes which have very small effects. And but you can sum up these effects in what is called a polygenic index. So a polygenic index can be interpreted as a measure of your genetic propensity for a trait. So the polygenic index for educational attainments measures your genetic propensity for educational attainment. And this is done by specialists who are doing genomic-wide association studies, which are basically just big correlation studies, where they correlate genetic differences with life course outcomes. So in the case for education, they're looking at how genetic variants are correlated with education. And then they based on that, you can construct polygenic indexes, which you can use then on other data sets. Okay. And these polygenic indexes, I think, are also nice to work with because they are comparable to any kind of other scale that we use in social science data sets. So this is basically one variable which gives you the genetic propensity for education or for some other outcome that you're interested in. And this is based on these huge data sets where they produce these genome-wide association studies. So this, for instance, is the latest study that was done for education, where they built a predictor for your genetic propensity for years of education. And this is what this graph is supposed to show. Then instead is that instead of a few genes having large effect, there are a lot of genes which have very, very small effect, very tiny effects. But if you add all these up, you can explain some part of the variance in the outcome. So this is showing now. So this is showing how much this polygenic index predicts actual attainment, educational attainment. So the polygenic index for years of education, how much it actually explains years of education. In another data set, in the US data set called EdHealth. And this R square is 16%. Okay, so this means that 16% of the variation in education attainment in this data set for the US is explained by the polygenic index for education, which also implies that there's still a lot of variation which is not explained by this. And you also see that there's a lot of deviation at the individual level. So your actual educational attainment and your genetic propensity for educational attainment can be quite different. So in the summer holidays, I was reading this one study where they were taking some hair off Beethoven and they were kind of then gene analyzing it, and they found out that Beethoven's genetic propensity for musicality was very bad. So he was below average actually. So I think so this means that your your actual individual educational attainment and your genetic propensity of educational attainment, they are two different things. Okay, but it's explaining something. It's explaining 60% of the variance in this US data set. And so what we are doing in this paper, basically on the German data, we're using this polygenic index for education and the polygenic indexes for cognitive skills and non-cognitive skills, instead of using the measures of observed skills that we used in the other papers. Okay, and we're doing this by trying to address this problem that otherwise they could be affected by your choices or by ascribed characteristics. But the genes, they cannot be affected because they are fixed at birth. So that's basically the idea. Now what are we going to show? So we have radical and liberal inequality of opportunity shown here. It's different because these are now between family estimates. So this is just the R square of a regression model. It's not this complicated sibling stuff before. And then we also, so we do this for the polygenic indices here on the left side. And on the right hand side, we're doing this for observed measures of skills, which is very much what we did on the other papers. And then we want to see whether it's different. So the results are clearest for education. They are actually a bit less clear for occupation and income. And there you see, again, the red bar is radical inequality of opportunity. It's higher than liberal inequality of opportunity. Okay. And if you compare these here with these, then actually there are some differences, but the conclusions are the same. So whether you use observed ability measures or whether you use these kind of genetic measures actually makes no difference to the conclusions. So this is a bit addressing this problem before that we have in the other studies. We have observed abilities at 16 or 17. And then the other thing what we're showing in this paper is actually the effects of ascribed characteristics are becoming smaller once you condition on the polygenic indices. Okay, so this is without conditioning, this is with conditioning, the liberal estimates. So this is kind of the comparison. So the sample is quite small, and we're trying, as I said, we're trying this now on different data where we also have information on siblings. But at least from this study, the kind of conclusion is in line with what I said, what we found in the other studies, that radical inequality is higher than liberal inequality of opportunity, and that you can actually use measures of cognitive and non-cognitive skills, because whether you use polygenic indices, like here on the left-hand side, or whether you use measures of skills, doesn't really affect the difference between radical and liberal inequality of opportunity. So that is the main conclusion from these studies. For theoretical reasons, we think that this kind of approach, which uses polygenic indices, is more valid, because, as I said, choices and ascribed characteristics after birth cannot change it anymore. But at least in terms of empirical results, it doesn't really make a difference. So this is the last slide, and then we come to the discussion. So there's of course there's a very big philosophical literature on this kind of different conceptions of equality of opportunity. And then often there's this discussion about individual cases and whether this is just or unjust. But I think the big question is, does this really matter? And what we're trying to do is to measure this at the population level. And what these results, I think, show is that it matters. So distinguishing between different conceptions of equality of opportunity matters because it gives different replies to the question, how much inequality is there in contemporary society? And if you think about education, so in the US, the inequality with respect to education is 65% from the perspective of radical inequality of opportunity and 30% from the liberal perspective. So this is a different conclusion, I think. And this, of course, means, and it matters, of course, because abilities affect life chances. I mean, the difference between both are these effect of abilities, and this is what is happening. Then of course, as I said before, this is kind of the conceptual framework, but probably the really interesting questions are whether this varies across countries, whether this has changed across cohorts, and whether this can be affected by policies. And these are kind of questions that we are coming to and we're trying to study in the future. So I have, with respect to countries, I've shown some evidence by comparing the US to Sweden, but we're trying to replicate this in the future, I think, for more countries. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. So as usual, we're going to have questions both from the floor and for people online, and the first half hour will be recorded. So use the chat function if you're online, and we allow for full questions, to say, put up your hand or write the question in the chat. But you can also follow up question, and then you write who you're following up to, or you put up a finger here. And I see that we already have a number of questions, so I should allow Moa to start.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. I really like this idea of radical equality of opportunity. But I also have some questions about it. And I was wondering if you could return to the slide where you show the differences between what, from early in the presentation, where the differences between the equality of opportunity and the radical one, and the things they consider just and unjust. Yeah, that one, yes. And I was just wondering, if you look at the radical equality of opportunity, I mean, to me, abilities are sort of highly correlated with the choices that we can make, right? If we have low abilities, the choices might not be as good. So is it really, does it really make, I mean, when you start to think about that, oh, you don't, it's a lottery with the abilities, then isn't it there also lottery when it comes to the choices that we make? And also considering that we are making choices in social contexts where one choice will lead to another. You mentioned this earlier, you said that, well, maybe kids are not responsible for their choices. But I mean, it's a path. I mean, it's a path of choices. I mean, your choices put you on a path, and it puts you in contexts where there might be constrained choices and so forth. So I was just wondering, when you start to think about equality in this way, isn't the final conclusion that all inequalities are unjust, because we really can't control, I mean, everything is really about the lack of luck and unluck in the different parts of life. So wouldn't like a really compressed earnings distribution be what makes sense if you want to have the most just society, because really, you know, it's all about luck in a way.
Yeah, thank you. So I mean, I was also saying in the beginning that there's inequality of outcome and inequality of condition, and your conclusion can be that this is what we should care about. I mean, I think this is certainly, and this is, for instance, also that's the position that John Galtung always has entertained. So this is a position that people can take up even in studying this. I mean, I would still say that in this kind of framework, choices are what is freely made once we control for ascribed characteristics and abilities. I mean, so this means not, so this would mean the choices you can make once the other things are similar. And also, I think this is what we're trying to do in the kind of empirical estimation, because we're not measuring this part, right? So we were just measuring basically what is unjust. And I think this would be the empirical approach that we're trying to do, is that I would try to do, is to try to measure as much as possible what we consider unjust and trying to maximize this and see how close we can get to 100%.
Just to follow up on that, I mean, as you know, there is a way of going with this kind of luck egalitarianism that exactly ends up in this position that you know, none of these differences are going to be justified because you don't have enough control over it. And that's one part. You mentioned somebody I haven't heard. The person you mentioned that drew this conclusion that it should only...
John Galtung. That's one of the kind of big figures in mobility, intergenerational mobility research. And I mean, he was basically always studying intergenerational mobility, but then saying that, yeah, what really kind of in the policy conclusions, what really matters is inequality.
Because there's two ways it comes from this kind of like egalitarianism and then kind of an early debate about, you know, freedom, or if you're completely non-free, it doesn't matter either. But that's a more complicated discussion. You happy with that? Yeah, sorry, can I just follow up another thing on that? What about risk attitudes? Where did they end up? Your attitudes to risk and similar things?
Yeah. we have it in some data, not in all data, and there's also a polygenic index for risk attitudes.
Okay,
So
you
that
you
can
could
be
control for
that can be included.
Yeah.
No, I don't know what it was included in
'Cause that
each
might be
specific paper, but
something that you're not really, it might even be genetic, how risk taking you are or something like that.
yeah, there's a polygenic index for risk attitudes. I know that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, Emma.
Hi. So there is this finding or discussion about Sweden being highly unequal in terms of wealth, but not income. So there is this sort of interesting result about Sweden and wealth in your study. And then, so I just wanted, if I interpret your results correctly, if I say, so the variance in wealth is not affected by ability in Sweden. Is that it?
Yeah.
Because they are, yeah. So that seems like a political kind of result, and it's sort of, it should affect how we tax inheritance and stuff. But you don't want to discuss.
Well, I mean, you don't tax it anymore, right? And then
Exactly, we
Switzerland,
don't,
in
but
Switzerland
we
there
should.
is still a wealth tax.
These are very interesting results.
Yeah, but it's also a bit. I mean, I'm just a bit puzzled by finding this, and it being different from the US. So for the moment, I'm
So what's your explanation? Because I was very curious about this.
yeah.
It's a result that stands out.
So that's for the US. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah, it's definitely something. I don't have a good explanation at the moment.
Not even
for
a
this.
speculation.
It's,
And it doesn't
surprising.
make any difference then if you include your state pensions and stuff like that. It wouldn't make, probably would even compress it more, perhaps.
I think we're including everything that we can
You said
include.
also in private.
Yeah, just a technical question on the wealth. I think it might be a little bit affected by that. You look at it.
Wait, you need a
relatively early
microphone.
in the life
You need a microphone.
Oh.
Then start over again.
Technical question on the wealth is that you measure it relatively early in the life course,
Yes,
and
yes.
it's this kind of only the brothers. So maybe these really wealthy people in society, they are like in their 70s, that like these huge genies that drive wealth inequality in Sweden. I think these people might not be the carrier of that wealth. These are more like kind of people that have generated a bit of wealth due to their housing and.
Yeah, I mean
and so
that's a bit. So we're kind of
So
the
we are
data. The cohort is a bit younger than the US cohort, and
See,
of
what's
course
the cohort for US?
for the US it's 57 till 64,
Okay, that's and here it is.
and here it's 60 till 79.
Oh, could that be enough to explain the difference?
Yeah, but definitely, I mean, one issue is that the wealth transfers you get from your parents, they didn't have yet, right? I mean, they will be
The
probably
wealth
too
transfer,
young.
some
for
of it might have
some of
happened. They
them
might have
maybe,
bought you
but
an apartment.
yeah, okay, if they.
So it is. Well,
Yeah.
I think it's worthwhile another paper. Very good. Then I had Martin next on the list, but that's another question.
Yeah, it is.
Go for it.
So if I understand these bars, right? So the liberal inequality of opportunity, it's kind of a sibling correlation where you have kind of decomposed the observable parts, kind of, the parental SES and so on. And the radical inequality of opportunity is where you have added a lot of like ego traits to this. So it's no longer things that are shared within the family, but also like your own traits that are measured at 18 and 20 and 24 and so on. And to me it seems like, and then you measure something at 22, and then you measure something new at like 45 or 50, which is your kind of outcome variable. So they're kind of on the same like life course train in a way, right? This individual is he's certainly good at something at age 22, and then he's certainly good at something at age 50, that outcome, and so on. And it seems to me that the closer that these kinds of ego traits are to the outcome you measure, right, the higher it will be. So if your cognitive ability test would be something like a cognitive test to go into law school, then it would predict being into law school very highly. So I think that's kind of, I think that will affect this entire approach. Like, I mean, it's not, it doesn't rule it out, but I think it will be important for how these kinds of things work out with different kinds of measures and different kinds of approaches and so on.
Yeah, yeah, but yeah, of course. I mean, there's also this idea that these things would be stable of the life course, but they are, of course, not completely stable. But I mean, so as I said, I mean, one solution is to measure it as early as possible, and the other solution is to use the PGIs instead of the observed measures.
And maybe as the, on Moa's comment, that I mean, so when I would think of this radical inequality opportunity, I would also think of like traditional inequality measures, such as Gini, right? That is how much inequality it is in the world. So like, how do you think your measure of radical inequality of opportunity is different from this kind of inequality perspective when you look at, kind of the leveling of the outcome? Like how do they speak to each other, do you think?
Yeah, no, it's a good point, but not at all at the moment, because I mean, this is about, we are trying to measure unjust variance, and it's very different from measuring the outcome, and it cannot be really compared to some measure of inequality at the moment. So I think this would require a completely different approach.
But wouldn't you expect that the measure of radical inequality of opportunity should be closer to the kind of some kind of Gini measure of income or wealth than?
I mean, we
inequality opportunities. You could make a comparison like that.
So I guess once we, if we manage to, and once we do the cross-country comparative study, we can compare this to Gini coefficients across countries, and we can see whether we can reproduce this idea of that there's a relationship between income inequality and inequality of opportunity, which is a very strong idea. But in terms of methodology, there's the methodologies are very different, so there's kind of no methodological connection.
But I thought you meant what I said, but did you mean a methodological connection, or that there would be? No, exactly, you meant
I
what I
mean
meant
just
too. Yeah.
how they are.
But I mean, you can you have like the end population with an income, right? So you can also just calculate the Gini of your population.
Yeah.
For this.
Yeah, but then we could only compare the Gini for Sweden and the Gini for the US, or what would you?
Yep.
What would you compare?
No, I mean, you could just look at the Gini of your outcomes in your population as kind of an interesting comparison point.
With respect to the different outcomes?
Yeah.
Yeah, but the Ginis are very different for these with different outcomes. So the Gini for education, we did this actually when I presented this the last time in Oxford, but I don't have it in the presentation anymore. But the Gini for education is pretty low. So the education has a very, very low Gini coefficient, and I wasn't sure what it actually means to have a Gini for education. So
I don't think that's what you meant.
Oh.
No,
It is. It's
exactly what I meant.
You want to look at the Gini for education? Oh, for each one. Okay.
for each different outcomes.
In wealth
So
or income.
yeah. So and then there's a correlation in the sense that so the Ginis are lower for education and occupation, and they are higher for income and for wealth. But yeah, I'm not so sure what it means.
Well, there wasn't that radical inequality. There was more radical inequality opportunity.
So there's more radical inequality.
No, there's less there, of course, but more
Yeah.
when it comes to they probably translate into income and wealth differences. That would be the idea.
Yeah.
Something like that. I mean,
Yeah.
I speculate. Joseph.
Yeah. Thanks again for the nice presentation. So my question is about this slide with the US, where the data is listed, so where it comes from. Yeah, exactly. So why did you take this gerontological study of the US? Why not something more new enough? I mean, like in 79 cohort. And the follow-up question is for you, is inequality so a natural constant? Would it be the same now as it was when this was measured?
No. So the answer to the second question is that we would really like to do a comparison across cohorts, because this idea, I mean, one of the big theories we don't have so many big theories in sociology, is modernization theory, which says that there's a move away from ascribed characteristics to achieved characteristics. And achieved characteristics would be abilities. So the idea would be that the kind of effects of social origin, so liberal inequality should go down, but radical inequality should go up, actually. or should be at least stay level perhaps because the effects of abilities are good. So that would be really something we would like to do, but we don't have, I don't know yet the data to do it. So that is also the answer to the first question is we're trying to look for data where we could do this. So there's not
totally accepted, but like in this data there is a lot in the US which pre-structures stuff. I mean, Jim Crow law, segregation, and so on. So how is this pictured in this 1381?
I mean, the only answer I can give you is that what we observe could be very specific for this cohort. I mean, we cannot generalize from that to other cohorts. But then the other thing is I mean, for years of education, okay, this is fine, but for the other outcomes, I mean, there's also, you try to measure income over a large time period as possible. You try to measure wealth when the people are old in the age. So for these outcomes, it's actually quite good to take an older cohort, because for them you can observe these outcomes as an older age. So there you also have this trade-off between looking at a more recent cohort where you can look at which is probably more relevant because we care more about the people who are born nowadays, but then you also want to measure the outcomes. So there's this trade-off.
Yeah, thanks.
Good. There's time for more questions, so please do that. Mats is next.
Great, thank you very much. Just first a small kind of comment on the terminology. To me, it doesn't seem anything radical about what you call radical. You should. I would love to see that framed as liberal opportunity of equality, or liberal equality of opportunity instead. But I assume you are kind of trapped in the terminology of the field. So my more substantive question is about the measures of life chances. So you listed a few of the life chances measures you have. And just to compare this to the discussions in political philosophy about equality of opportunity, a very common and popular measure there would be not any of these, but rather well-being. Mm-hmm. And there are other ways or other approaches to try to measure well-being. And have you looked into those at all? Life satisfaction, for example?
No. The short answer is no, we didn't yet. But it's a good idea. So perhaps we should do it in the future. Yes. I mean, this is more where I come from. You study education, occupation, income. So this is how they started. But I'm also trying to, I mean, really the aim is to study life chances. I mean, and then to use the best measure of life chances that you can think about. So if you say this, that we should be using other measures, I mean, I'm happy to do it. And also about the terminology, I don't. I mean, if you have better suggestions, I'm happy to use the better suggestions.
May I? Just another kind of very quick question also, as not coming from this field at all. When you talk about ascribed characteristics, are they only social origin kind ascribed characteristics? Because in the philosophical literature we would also, I mean, talk about, say, disabilities, for example. And one would argue rules, for example, that having different abilities to walk should not at all impact your life chances. Is that anything that's being taken into account in these kind of studies?
It's very rarely taken into account in empirical, sociological, and I think also economics research. So that is a good point. So the ascribed characteristics, which was also good for me to learn, that this is a term which is philosophers are not familiar with, is the traditional ones are really social origin, gender, and migration background. Okay, and so in terms of empirical implementation, I'm just not sure which kind of variables we would have in the data to include it. But it's a good point.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Very good. Any more questions? We're all convinced? Yes, case. join me, and thank you for this very, very interesting talk.
Thank you.
And next week, October 2nd, we have Lina Eriksson, political scientist, going to talk about changing social norms. What levers can we pull? She's from University of Gothenburg. And after that, we have Bashir from the Open University of Israel and the Van Leer Institute. He's going to talk about egalitarian binationalism for Israel and Palestine. That's on October 9th. Very welcome.